everybody. Welcome to the Reproducibility podcast. Today you have Sarah and Sam. So I'm Sarah. I'm coming to you from St. John's in Canada. I'm living on the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the island of Newfoundland is part of the traditional territories of the Mi'kmaq.
That's nice. And I'm Sam. I'm currently based in the Netherlands, in Nijmegen. Eventually I'll get the pronunciation of things correct.
Nijmegen, approximately. My family, part of my family is from the Netherlands, so I've not been to Nijmegen, but I spent quite a bit of time in Den Haag and in Amsterdam and in Assen in the north.
So it's a nice
place.
So
today, I bet. Today we're going to talk about SlowScience. So I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but Sam, do you want to give a bit of an overview of what that means?
Yeah. So I think what I find helpful is thinking of SlowScience as slower science than what we're currently experiencing. Partly it's a reaction to the increased pressure to publish, acquire funding, etc., in an increasing kind of more and more constantly, which in many ways people think led to aspects around replicability issues, etc., because it forces researchers to focus on quantity rather than quality. If you're trying to output 10 papers a year rather than one, perhaps you don't have the time to dedicate even enough time to kind of adequately put into those works. So the idea of SlowScience is really, I guess, a kind of rebellion, so to speak, against those norms. So the idea that trying to work not only more slowly in terms of the specific outputs, but more deeply in terms of the work that goes into work and time, I suppose, into individual outputs, but also allowing more time for other kind of non-publication grant acquiring activities, whether that's better outreach, better just learning how to do this thing we call research. But I think we kind of have to consider it as a slower than we currently see, because slow kind of implies that there's only one speed that works. I think, whereas I think we can maybe just about all agree that the current speed is too fast. But what slow is perfect, I think, is harder to pinpoint. So perhaps it might just be a personal thing from me, but slower than it currently is feels good. But how slow that is going to be a variable.
Yeah, I like that. I think it's not great to be too prescriptive, right? We want to give space for people to do things the way that works for them. Excuse me, my voice is a little bit funny this morning. Yeah, I feel like things have gotten, in a sense, almost exponentially faster. I don't know if that's an actual quantifiable thing we can measure, but I know that, like, for example, my supervisor started his job here at Memorial University 6 or 7 years ago now, and even he says he wouldn't get a job now, right? Like, it shouldn't be, and the guideline that I was given was I need to have 15 first authored papers to be considered for a job.
For a faculty
position. Yeah.
Okay.
Faculty tenure track position in North America. 15 first authored papers after a couple of years as a postdoc. That is way too many papers.
Cry in the corner for.
Yeah, it is not a reasonable or sustainable expectation. But I applied for 2 jobs recently at MUN, and because my supervisor was tangentially involved in the job search, I got to see like who the candidates were, and we looked them up on Google Scholar. And one of them, a postdoc, had like 20 or 30 publications. And I was like, I do not understand how that works, right? Maybe, I know some people go all into it with their jobs. That might be it. It might also be that a lot of them were like smaller conference papers, which is fine. So they're weighed differently. And like, I certainly have more conference presentations than I do first author papers, and I think that's pretty normal. But not all of them have papers attached to them. And it varies by field. I know this, right? Like with the more engineering side, when I was in my PhD, you tweak the algorithm and then you can publish a new paper. So every couple of months you can publish a new paper. Whereas when you're collecting EEG data, doing any kind of neuroscience or any kind of even behavioral experiment, it's going to take several months to collect the data. So by definition, it's going to take you longer. So those are taken into account. But still, the number that I was given was 15. And have an international, a major federal grant, and be internationally recognized, and this, and that. This is not possible. What you're asking is for me to essentially put all of myself in my work and do nothing else. And I'm not interested in that.
Yeah. And it's kind of this slight tangent, but it's wild to see. I don't think that the irony is lost on the more senior folk that, let's briefly say that the standards were lower, to be somewhat crass about it.
Yeah.
But I think it's not lost on them that it's harder now. The bar is kind of increasing. But I think there is a kind of earnestness in terms of like, there is a genuine, I'm trying to help you like get the job, if you want to get a faculty position, here's kind of what you need to do it. And I kind of get that folk kind of want to help and show you what's needed, and especially when they've been on these searches, they've seen the candidates that have got it, and I kind of get sort of saying the truth of the current situation. It's just even with that kind of positive kind of rationale for sharing and all of that, it still places the pressure a hell of wildly too high, particularly on early career people, particularly anybody that, let's say, doesn't have the resources or the capacity or any number of other things that sort of makes the lower bar for entry still far too high.
Yeah, it's almost like everyone has to be a superstar. You can't it's not good enough to just do good work.
Yeah.
You have to be exceptional at everything. It's like, that's not possible. And I definitely appreciate all the support that I get. My supervisor's awesome and is very straight with me, right? He's not going to sugarcoat anything. He'll say it's difficult.
Yeah.
It's possible, but it is difficult, and you will be disappointed and you're going to be rejected a lot. Yeah, okay. At the same time, that like the cynical part of me is like, yeah, but who's on the search committee? Like it's other researchers.
Yeah.
Right. So it like those pressures are still there. Is it coming from them? Maybe not. Like, I think it's worth thinking about where these pressures come from. Why is it that we're pushed to produce always more, and that it's accelerating in the past few years? Or that's what it feels like, at least.
Yeah, and I think there will always be a baseline kind of raising of the bar in terms of, I don't know, as technology changes, we don't have to spend weeks at a time going into library and getting physical copies of like that. There's a lot of things that make aspects of this kind of work much quicker than it used to be. So even from that perspective, there will be some aspects that make kind of achieving the same level of output roughly equivalent. However, the rate of that kind of increase seems to be well far outpacing what's feasible or healthy.
Yeah,
and there will always be
it takes less time
as well.
Yeah, it takes less time to do these things. So it takes less time to look up a paper, but there's so much more material. So we're no longer expected to read like the 3 or 4 foundational texts. It's like, have you read the 1 million papers that you're supposed to read? It's like, no, I ain't got time for that. No one's got time for that. And so the conversation is lost. I think we talked a little bit about this in our episode about contributorship, where we lose that, or at least for me, in my experience, I don't feel like I have the time to put aside, say, a day or a couple of hours, even a week, to go look into the literature I read things when I have to, when I'm writing something specific and looking for specific sources. Because there is so much out there, you just you can't keep up with it. And for me, everything always ties back to large systemic movement. So capitalism and neoliberalism, we can't escape them. They have increasingly, I think, infiltrated academia and institutions and put pressure on production, right? This idea that growth is the only way to move forward, that more is always better. But I think we need to really, really push back on that, because that's not what I understand science to be. It's not about just more. It has to be about quality as well. Otherwise, what are we doing?
And I think that's came up in, many, many discussions around open science, replicability, etc. over the last decade, probably longer. I'm pretty sure that, Merton, maybe, has actually kind of covered some of these points many decades ago. Just, you can't maintain quality or the same level of quality given more and more output, right? There's a reason why in basic production the mass-produced stuff isn't as good as something that's actually being kind of toiled upon to make as best as it could possibly be.
But neoliberalism puts pressure on that, on metrics, on measuring output. How many of each things did you do? And that bleeds into things like I forget the exact name, but the research framework that exists in the UK. You probably could name it.
The research excellence framework.
Yeah, that.
If in doubt, there's the word excellence in most BS enterprises like these. There's also the teaching excellence framework that is just as pretty universally hated.
Yeah, it's all about measuring and metrics and how do you quantify everything that you do, but there's so much labor in academia that is, I think, can't really be quantified, and maybe increasingly so. I don't know. It feels like there's more exploration of bridging the gap between these types of things, like scholarly podcasting. What does that go into? Does that go into scholarly output? Does that go into teaching? Does that go into service? Right? So I don't know how it works in other places. In North America, it's typically research, teaching, and service. And those are the three main activities that you do. But there are many things that don't quite fit into those, right? Like a reproducibility journal club. Where does that fit into? Is that research? Is that teaching? Is that service? I think you could argue for all three. But you're forced to try to pigeonhole what you do, which I don't think is super conducive to properly evaluating what we do, because all of it is more general than that. And this drive towards pigeonholing and getting specific outputs and getting tangible and material outputs is a very neoliberal goal. And we've not been fighting against that hard enough in our universities.
And I appreciate that on some level, some level of categorization, even soft categorization, some metrics may be useful. But I do find it interesting how quickly discussions around open science and capturing indexes of quality have basically fallen into the same sort of trappings. It's it's interesting, may not be an ideal word. It's somewhat disheartening at times to kind of see that there is this attempt to sort of generate something new, but in the most fundamental way, it recreates the wheel. So, for example, the top factor for assessing journal quality, I think, from Center for Open Science, and largely, again, it's a checklist of, do they offer registered reports? Do they mandate open data and so on? And it's much more nuanced than something like the general impact factor, which is we don't need to explain why it's horrible. We know it is basically meaningless, especially as a way to judge individual contributions. But then something like the top factor also kind of serves to basically do the same thing, maybe in a nuanced way, but it still has all the potential trappings. It still has that capacity for, again, once you measure something, it becomes a less ideal target, or whatever the actual phrasing of that saying is. As soon as we decide how to quantify something, it's gameable, right? It's the exact same thing happens and is still happening with the Center for Open Science badges. Like, what do they mean? They're supposed to be indicators of quality as defined by, actually, exactly as you're saying, does this paper produce more? Does it also have the data and the code, etc., which I do think is valuable. But the indicator of that doesn't necessarily highlight whether it's sort of done what it said that it's doing. You can get an Open Science badge from having heard horror stories about this. Might have to validate. For having a CSV file that within it says, please contact authors for access to data. It's like, that's not... Like, it's very possible that these new metrics are just as either gameable or poorly adhered to. Or policed, governed, as is necessary to make them do what they want to do. So I always...
two things.
Yep.
I'm thinking about quality and accountability. So I guess to start with quality, this came up. We both read two short pieces. We'll put them in the show notes to sort of like start to frame this discussion. And in one of them, he talks about quality versus quantity, but then the question of, how do you evaluate quality? Because quality is different for different people. I think that's an important point. I don't think it's possible to have overall markers of quality that everyone's going to agree on. I think it has to be idiosyncratic because of the variability across all fields, subfields, just individuals. And I guess part of that is addressed in peer review. That is idiosyncratic. You get different responses based on different people. And whether you get accepted to a journal or not will depend on who has reviewed it. I've got two papers right now that I think both their fourth journal. And it just depends who's reviewing. So I think it's interesting to think about how we want to measure quality and if we can measure quality. And then the other thing I was thinking about was accountability, because I understand that these metrics, I think originally were created so that we're accountable to our funders. And I get that. That makes sense. We're taking public money, the vast majority. It makes sense that someone is watching out and seeing that we're actually doing the work that we said we were going to do, and seeing that work is good and worth the investment from the public. But I think it's gotten too far, where we spend so much time trying to meet very specific criteria that we don't have the freedom to think really beyond that, or to create beyond those specific things. And it takes really intentionally challenging this system to come up with new ideas of doing things differently, like scholarly podcasting.
Yeah. So, no, I agree. I think this it's the danger of. I think that the rebuttal that will always be given to a more nuanced perspective and a more idiosyncratic perspective is just simply that we don't have time. And I agree on some level. On the flip side, I think if we were to focus on even if we're considering only kind of the standard output, so let's say papers and the materials that surround those, if we were to kind of have the capacity, the permission almost to focus on fewer rather than hopefully getting as many as possible, hitting that 15 minimum, then we sort of have time to make that quality work. And sorry, so take a step back. So, and I think things like that would reduce the amount of output and therefore give more time to be able to assess more idiosyncratically. But we can also do things in other ways. So the Declaration on Research Assessment has potential, at least, to improve aspects around the judgment and the hiring criteria, to at least avoid the spamming of H indexes and journal impact factors as proxies for measurement of quality. I don't quite think DORA goes far enough, and it's not massively well adhered to. I don't think at the university level, but I think there are some pushes, but I think, as you said earlier, Sarah, the pushes need to be stronger. And in some ways, it comes back to the wonderful Tally Arconi blog post of kind of we are the incentives. Essentially, we talk about the incentives, but we are the people doing the judgment and the critique of other people's work, or at least senior academics are. I don't claim to be in a position where I can make hiring decisions and so forth, but we're the ones doing review. We're the ones acting as gatekeepers. So we kind of have the capacity in every one of these decisions to push against this. And I'm not saying it's easy.
It takes thought. Or it takes effort, I think, especially to change at first. And then once you get used to doing something, then it becomes habit. I've found this in a lot of big changes in my life, right? Like starting to reduce plastic waste and trying to live like a zero waste lifestyle, right? At first it was a lot of effort, and now a lot of those things are just habit. The way that I write, the way that I do my statistics has changed. And at first it was a big effort, and then it just becomes habit. And the way that I think about reviewing has changed recently, where at first it was like this chore that I'm not getting paid for. And I'm like, well, other people are actually reviewing my work and taking the time to do it, so I'm going to reciprocate and take the time and see it as an opportunity to bring up things that I'm interested in. So bring up critiques from feminist science of like, can you be more strongly objective here? Can you give more context for your work? Have you looked at your reference list? Who are you referencing? Are there women there? Are there people of color there? Are there other minorities? Are there early career researchers there? And I often have to talk about the statistics of being like, you're applying Bayesian logic to frequentist statistics. That happens all of the time. But yeah, so thinking of reviews as a site to spread these ideas about doing science differently, where they're more almost one-on-one with the authors, right? It's mediated by the journal and ish anonymous. I've not found any paper I've reviewed recently to be anonymous, just because of the way things work, right? Like with a lot of pre-registration becoming more of a thing, a lot of these papers would be like, oh, our stuff is all on OSF, but we're not going to give you the link because anonymity. And I'm like, well, if the project exists, I can Google it. And I can find you that way, right? Like anonymity just doesn't exist anymore. And then another one had like a specific clinic. So I was like, I can look that up, it's just, we talked about this elsewhere. I think in the SIPS episode, like anonymity is out the window anyway. But yeah, so it's essentially a one-on-one conversation that you get to have with the authors. So like using that as an opportunity to slow things down or to bring in ideas about how to do science a bit differently.
And that's really nice from a I guess, a bottom-up kind of perspective. So one of the things I was curious to get your take on, especially after rereading the Frith paper, Fast Lanes to Slow Science, that again we'll link in below. So one of the things that came out of that paper and sort of sparked, I think, a rediscussion, actually. I don't think that this proposal was actually new. In fact, very little of what was in the paper was new, but I think it was useful to have a very senior, very famous researcher kind of reshare some of these ideas. Anyway, so I'm curious. So we talked about the kind of bottom up from reviewing. I'm curious a little bit to hear your perspective on the more top down kind of almost mandates idea. So we're often overly, I think, kind of jump the gun a little bit on wanting a mandated solution. So what if everybody just had to do X? So the proposal in this paper was to drastically reduce the amount of papers and grants that researchers are allowed to hold. They suggest aiming for only one paper a year, at least in their work. So I'm curious your perspective on mandating a paper limit.
Yeah, Again, I think it's too variable for different people, depending on the field, depending on what they do, depending on how they work, to mandate the number of papers. I think mandating the number of grants is a really interesting idea. Because the pattern that I feel like I'm seeing is that if you have a grant, you will get more grants, and if you have no grants, you'll be awarded no grants. And it's just this vicious cycle of, like, if you haven't gotten to the ground floor, you're just, like, you're kind of toast. Which isn't great. So it's, again, capitalism. It concentrates wealth in the hands of few, right? So it just increasingly, concentrates wealth in the hands of the few researchers and few labs that already have the resources. Now, I know that, like, in Canada, there are efforts to distribute more funds. There are some, like, entry level, just tell us what you want to do and we'll give you $5,000. It doesn't really matter if you do it or not, but it's just a way to, like, spread. I'm like miming throwing money around, just like spread the wealth out a little bit. And there are sort of new initiatives being piloted to try to encourage disciplinary work, and I think there are certain efforts towards that, but it certainly feels like, part of the criteria to be awarded a grant, what have you, is demonstrating excellence. And that often includes, do you already have funding? And so if we could get past that and go, this person may not have secured funding before because they are in their early career, and maybe they didn't get the competitive PhD grant or the competitive postdoc grant, but that doesn't mean that their work isn't valuable. So let's, like, spread the wealth out a little bit more. So I think I could see a place for reducing the number of grants someone can hold, but I'm not entirely convinced by the number of papers. Because, like, I have some papers that are experimental based, I have some papers that are neuroscience, and I have some papers that are just, like, position papers, writing about something. And as long as I have a job, I don't need a grant to fund that separately. So, like, I don't want to necessarily have to wait to publish that.
Yeah, I think this came out, I think, over a year ago now, possibly 2, maybe 3. My sense of time has been ruined over the last couple of years.
Oh, yeah,
COVID,
same.
Plus, baby, oh God, this was as far back as 2019. I remember getting annoyed about these discussions way back then. So it shocked me a little bit how many people were very enthusiastic about the idea of restricting the number of outputs that people are in terms of papers, in this case, in terms of numbers. And there was a lot of discussion about, like, what that number should be rather than whether this is a good idea in the first place. And I found that quite stark, because it doesn't take much to think about how this is going to benefit some people and not benefit others. If you're a PI in a lab with 3 PhD students, you're going to
who gets the publication?
Who gets the publication? Which journal is it going to be in? And so I can kind of see it just making exactly what we're looking at kind of worse.
Plus, you can never tell if something will be published, right? Like, I have things in the pipeline right now. One of them started last year. 2 of them started 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Just because of the way that publishing works, it takes so long to go through the process that, like, how can you really plan those things?
Oh, yeah. How many early career people would there be that would be looked at as, oh, you didn't publish in, well, I was going to say 2020, but there's lots of reasons for that. Let's say 2015 for the sake of a less, or in fact, that would be pretty bad for some people. Every year is horrible.
Yeah, I think 2020 would probably have more publications because people had time, maybe, depending on their home contexts, to actually work on the data they had. But then when they couldn't collect data, that's going to have a delay. So there might be a gap in like 2022, 2023.
Well, and that's it. Yeah, even 2020 is there being less people to review. Like, all you need is your review to be delayed by 3 months, and suddenly you don't have a publication that year, right?
Yeah.
So like, there's so many little things that I can imagine would kind of basically tank somebody's application.
Yeah.
Based on their publication record because of something like this. And let's say we increase the numbers a little bit more. One of the things that I'm seeing, so I'm currently preparing a fellowship application myself that they've sort of tried to avoid the number counting, but they also have like their maximum number of papers that you can include is 10. And the advice is basically, if you include less than 10, have you done enough? And I'm sitting there going, this is supposed to be a grant for people that are a few years out of their PhD. So what counts? How is this judged? And it's interesting how initiatives to try and kind of, again, be more slower science based can still have actually quite an inequitable kind of threshold, and again, adherence to whichever metric is convenient, accessible. Time.
I wonder if it would be somewhat useful to have like a rough guideline of like, if someone publishes a paper per year, they're doing good work, just fine, but not to like restrict it to 1 paper a year. To be like, I don't know. It's tricky to use the right words, because then if you say, okay, this is good, well, then someone's going to go, well, I want to be excellent. And then they publish more. And then, already, so the whole thing is at the window, like immediately. So I don't know. I don't know what the solution is.
I think this is a great example.
I want less, but I don't know that I want to like mandate a number.
I think mandates will always get a kind of response from me, and actually in this paper it quite nicely, when people kind of like say something but they don't quite realize they've said it, kind of like when a racist basically outs themselves. That's not what happened here, just to be very clear. But the follow-up point to reducing or limiting the number of publications is that this could lead to new models of science communication and could overcome some of the kind of issues of traditional journals and kind of maybe solve credit issues. And I couldn't help but sit there and go, well, we've got preprints. So if we limit the number of papers and people have 1 per year, great. There's still going to be somebody that has 20 preprints versus somebody that has 5. So we still fall into that potential for kind of bean counting. And this is not to say that there shouldn't be things that are done. I think it's not too difficult to assess, for example, candidates for jobs or fellowships and so on, limiting to like a maximum number of kind of, these are the most relevant papers. Great.
Yeah.
Something like that to me makes sense, because you can avoid at least some of the kind of metric counting. It's nowhere near perfect, but it feels a lot more kind of, you can integrate it much better with the different requirements and kind of standards across fields, for example, in career stages.
Like, what are your top 3 contributions? What do you conceive to be your top 3 contributions to your field? And then you can, pick your strongest.
And don't get me wrong, there will be problems with that too. But it feels less of a mandate, and it feels more trying to push us to do, as you said, kind of assess researchers in a more holistic way, assess their contributions in a less kind of metric-based, how much has been produced kind of way, and actually gives, again, that capacity to try and assess quality rather than quantity. Because at the very least, you've kind of capped quantity to a certain extent. In terms of how a candidate, a research line, something is assessed.
To restrict, you're not assessing the entire thing, you're assessing this portion of it and comparing those between people. And again, like you said, there's going to be problems with that, but I feel like it's maybe marginally better. Anyway, it reminds me, in talking of preprints, about how open science may or may not support slow science. So things like, I think a registered report supports slow science because it encourages thinking and critiquing things before data is actually collected. I think that's a really great way to slow down a project to make sure that it is of quality. But things like preprints, I feel like do the complete opposite, where there are so many more preprints than there are papers. And how can you possibly keep up with reading them? And as far as I understand, part of the advantage of a preprint is that people can give you feedback right away. But like, I don't spend time looking for preprints to give feedback to. That is not part of my workflow. I do not have time to do that. So preprints, in a sense, multiply the output that we have, which is advantageous potentially for applications given the context that we're in. But if we're talking about slowing things down, preprints kind of aggravate the problem.
Yeah, I guess it depends how preprints are used in that sense. So a preprint used more as a postprint, I think, kind of, I mean, basically you're getting around open access issues, or attempting to. So I don't think that adds to it as much. I think if it's used as a feedback mechanism, then it feeds into slow science in the sense of errors can be detected in an extreme case, but also it can kind of make more public the aspects of feedback review, kind of changes in manuscripts and so on. I think that the challenge that I see for the most part with preprints is the clarity behind, like, the rationale for it being posted. It's like for me, I post everything as preprints largely so that I can get green open access for everything. And for the most part, very little will change in the manuscript and so on. For other fields, they only have preprints, right? They throw it up on their archive equivalent, and peer review happens in the open and don't have to worry about, I mean, there is still peer review, but you're not kind of doing it through the journal mechanism that we're all so fond of.
Right. I guess to me, it doesn't reduce the problem of many outputs. Like, preprints in a way encourage more output.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Which is, it feels contrary to the slow science ideals.
I think it may be contrary to the slow, but I think it feeds into the open.
Yes.
So it's maybe a different goal that it meets, while also somewhat potentially hindering the other one.
Yeah. I mean, I'm interested in thinking about the limits of open science. We did one episode about that. We keep talking about it. And where does open science not grade against, but where is it in opposition to other goals that we find valuable?
Yeah.
Right. So in what ways we want slow science, we want open science. In what ways do those things work together? In what ways do they clash? Can we harmonize them more? Can we make one serve the other, or can we make them serve each other better? And how can we reduce those clashes?
I like that. So I guess as we somewhat head closer to the end of this, I want to make one final pivot from the Frith paper talking about slow science, and move into the public sphere of kind of open science, slow science, and think about how, similar to you were talking about, the tension between the kind of slow science and the way that we discuss and disseminate science, which tends to be much quicker, even if we're talking about slow science. So you made the point about registered reports, for example, and something that I've definitely seen is, or are discussions that immediately see something that's a registered report as much more trustworthy than something that isn't a registered report. And it's a very kind of reflexive, I understand the rationale for registered reports increases quality in some ways, it has additional transparency, blah, blah, blah. But there's a very, I guess, not slow science friendly critique that goes into that, where we, again, assume that certain metrics or indicators automatically mean quality or low quality in some cases. And particularly within the open science sphere that is so active on social media, particularly Twitter, that is not a friend to slower conversations, purely by the format. So we kind of have this situation where whatever the speed the science is going, the discussion of that science is very quick, as is the critique, whether it's slamming a paper, as sort of see far too often, that has its own issues, or whether it's being overly positive about a paper, as I'm sure we've all seen at some point or another, for those who do the at the minute, feels like doom scrolling on Twitter 99% of the time, that paper looks good, lots of people are talking about it, and then 2 days later it's kind of like, is it? Is it really? Like there's these issues, actually conceptually there's problems with it, as well as feeding into a number of other issues that we could talk about.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting to talk about slow critique as well, which is the topic of the other paper that we were further discussion around. And yeah, how fast is on Twitter. So I'll share that most of my Twitter is not academic. I made a very conscious decision to move away from academic Twitter. For me, it was because there was so much pressure, it felt like, to produce. Everyone was talking about all the papers they were writing, all the things they were doing, all the tools they were creating, all the things they were reading. And I was like, I cannot keep up. And I feel like I'm not doing enough. And I don't want to feel that way, because the work that I do is enough. And so I consciously don't follow those spaces. But I also hear good things, mostly from feminist contexts, about how helpful Twitter can be. About how they'll talk about what a great community it is, and how they get awesome feedback and generous feedback, and they're held accountable, but in good ways that are not about tearing each other down, but building each other up. And I think that just sounds so nice, but I'm not entirely sure just where to find that, or how to curate my feeds to achieve that. I think there's, like I said, the word accountability. There's no tolerance for shitty behavior. in these kinds of spaces. And they're a lot more generous, I think, because those spaces are lacking elsewhere in the Twitter sphere. There's like a need to create that. It's mostly, as far as like the ones that I know of, all like marginalized people of on various identities. Yeah. This idea of public scholarship is also really interesting to me, right? Where you work through things on Twitter and you share your ideas and you debate things and like in a really constructive way. And I'm like, wow, that sounds so good. But I've not figured out how to like achieve that for myself yet.
It's definitely a challenge. And I've definitely not mastered anywhere near of this, and I'm actually a lot less active on Twitter now than I used to be, for exactly the reasons that you described. When the world feels like it's burning, I kind of don't need to hear about the the latest paper or yet another Bayesian frequentist slap fight kind of nonsense.
Right. Yeah. Like our engagement with activism. This is something that I've been thinking about the past couple of years as well. And I think I've mentioned before, I decided to leave academia at the beginning of COVID. And part of the reason that I've been convinced to stay is that I know that people are doing things differently. It's communities like SIPs, like reproducibility, that are trying to do things differently that convince me to want to stay, to take my time, to do things differently.
The positive, constructive spaces, I think, is a really important point, and it's in theory, it's something that's curatable on Twitter, but then there's also many, many ways that can break down as well. And it's unfortunate to see kind of the open science community very much engaging in basically exactly the same culture that I think in general they think they're above. So thinking that things are more equitable, thinking that critique is fairer, more based on quality, and so on. But then you have conversations that are trashing some early career author for not engaging in some behavior. You get a bunch of papers trashed that rightfully so critiqued some aspects of kind of open and reproducible science, whether its pre-registration is not necessarily perfect. And doing that in a very actually SlowScience, thoughtful way. And then you get a white guy that publishes the same arguments in a much less well-written way. And everybody, there's a very quick, oh yeah, this is great. We should have thought about this before. There's some good points raised here. And it's a shame to see the same wheel being created in a way that it shouldn't be. The open is there for a reason. And part of that is having a space where the critique can be slow and thoughtful and not call outy and awful. In a previous episode, we talked about kind of getting feedback at conferences, and I think it's kind of similar. Like there's thoughtful feedback and critique, and there's just senior researchers being a dick. And the exact same thing happens in the open science sphere, which is a shame, because ultimately it harms the aim of trying to be an inclusive space. And I've talked to lots of people that have explicitly said that that's their reason for not wanting to be involved, at the very least in the community side. Like, yeah, great, I agree with the principles. I also don't want to be involved in a place where there's just people saying horrible, horrible stuff who are usually in positions of power. And again, Twitter is great because you can curate your feed. However, when a community isn't critical of the members of that community, as exactly as you said, it needs to be a community that doesn't tolerate intolerance.
Yeah. Because how
Because
do you enforce that, right? It's trying to figure out
yeah.
how we're going to do that together, how we're going to hold people accountable for what they say or how they say it. And it takes work, but I think it's doable. I mean, it comes back to, again, systematic issues of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy. And I think we can chip away at that in many different ways in speaking up in groups. Unfortunately, if only minoritized people are speaking up, they're probably going to be smacked right back down, which is why we need allyship from senior white men primarily. And other, like, whatever position of privilege you hold, I, as a early career white woman, there's a certain amount of power that I hold. And it's figuring out how to use that in spaces, calling out things when you see them. But the more power someone has, this sounds silly, then the more power they have to make change. Like, of course, like, obviously. But we need those people to be willing to do that.
Yeah.
I think one small way that occurred to me in terms of talking about, like, oh, this famous person wrote the thing, then it becomes popular. One way we can fight against that, I think, is through citational politics, by choosing very carefully who we cite. So instead of citing that person that wrote that paper that got real famous, where do those ideas originate? Cite that instead.
Yeah.
I think it's difficult. It takes effort, because even like search engines will prioritize white dudes. Like, it's so built in. But I think talking to each other, networking, we have those networks amongst each other, amongst ourselves. And we can choose refusal. I think it's a very, very powerful thing that I've come across mostly in Indigenous scholarly writing. This idea of refusing to do something, refusing to buy in to the spaces, just and saying no to people. You're not allowed in this space. Refusing to cite certain people. If you want to go the citation way, to say, this is my list of people that I'm never going to cite, maybe. I don't know. That might be too extreme, or it might be something that you choose to do. But there are ways of placing boundaries for our own mental health. And then I think, if we're talking about slow science in general and open science in general, to improve those things and make them safe spaces.
Yeah. So I guess we're probably coming close to time. So I wonder if maybe if we both give a quick summary of I don't know, what slow science thing do we see as, I don't know, important? What take homes do we have from this nebulous and branching conversation?
Oh, good question.
That might be putting you on the spot.
That's okay. I mean, if I think of slow science and how I want to do it, I think I've already slowed down quite a bit from my decision to leave academia and then come back. Like, I'm still doing a lot, but I am intentionally also saying no to things and only doing as much work as I have the capacity to do, while keeping my evenings and my weekends free. And so my output is going to be reduced, but I have decided that I am okay with that. And I will be looking for a job in academia. If I get one, great. And if I don't, then see ya. Like, I don't care enough. But that is a privilege that I have. And I recognize that I can make the choice to slow down. So I think it comes, I don't know, on an individual level, there's a lot that you can do, and making that choice can make a difference. And then where you can, apply pressure in a systematic way. Like speaking maybe to your supervisors who are senior about what it's like to be on a search committee, or editors that you may know. How you do your reviews. I think all of that comes into play. How you interact on Twitter. Like, all of these things that we've touched on are all actions that we could take individually, but they are also all sites where we can apply systematic pressure.
Nice.
So choose what works for you. I think that to me is a takeaway. We can't all do everything, but choose something that's going to work for you.
Yeah, I like that. I think for me the word that kind of carried on coming up was accountability, and I really like that as a framing for whatever we mean by slower science, whether it's trying to produce less in the pursuit of quality over quantity, or do things kind of differently for kind of similar reasons. That accountability of are we relying ourselves on metrics that we know are meaningless? Are we kind of compensating for a lack of time, a lack of resources by kind of neglecting to pay attention to these factors that we know are both a result of and cause further inequity? And as you kind of just said, we sort of have the individual and the collective power to do something about that. And related to that then, I guess, is to bounce off your kind of last point about having the privilege to do things, is that at the very least, the more senior you are, the more potential privilege you have to be slower, right? Like you're not under anywhere near as much pressure to put out as much as possible, to chase whatever metrics. And that's not to say that there aren't pressures. It's to say that there is the privilege there to not being count and chase numbers. And there are things that can be done at all stages, and exactly as you said, the kind of privilege that you have is power in this case, and we can use that, whatever slow science means to us. Like, it's doable on some level, and it's doable from an individual and collective perspective that doesn't have to rely on over the top mandates or similarly fast and thoughtless critiques of what should or shouldn't be the case based on our own definition of slow science.
Yeah, I think in a sense change can be collective, right? Pick one thing that you can do to start with, and once that becomes normal for you, pick another one. Slowly add one thing at a time to change, because it takes a lot of effort to make a change, and not everyone has the capacity to change everything at once. Like, you can't. But it reminds me of Mariam Kaba saying, nothing worth doing is done alone. And so we have that collective power as well. And I think that's part of, I think, what we want for this community, for our listeners, for reproducibility more widely as a community, is that we're there to support each other in making science better, however we think that looks. That might be a nice,
that's the perfect
place
tone to end on.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, everyone. If you want to start your own reproducibility journal club, check out the website at reproducibility.org. You can find me on Twitter at Sarah_Sauvé. Where can we find you, Sam?
I'm Sam_D_Parsons. It sounds
Very
more
good.
like saying it.
Yeah. Well, it'll be in the show notes. Check out the readings that we have shared there, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
You listened to Reproducibility Season 2, Episode 6, Slow Science. This episode was hosted and produced by Sarah Sauvé and Sam Parsons, and edited by Jan Vornheim. For more information, visit reproducibility.org. Thank you for listening.